Progressive activists are calling on Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer to retire before next year's midterm elections. The 82-year-old is the oldest justice on the High Court by 9 years. The Clinton appointee is one of 3 liberals remaining on the court after former President Trump was able to fill 3 vacancies during his term. Some on the left fear waiting any longer could risk losing an opportunity to replace Breyer with another liberal judge. One of those activists is Brian Fallon. He is the executive director of Demand Justice and joins us now from Arlington, Virginia. Brian, welcome. Great to have you with us. Why do you believe Justice Breyer must step down as soon as possible?
Well, we want to avoid a repeat of the unfortunate situation that occurred last fall. I think that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was an icon for many progressives on the Supreme Court. You can still purchase RBG-related memorabilia in a lot of stores, not just in Washington, D.C., but across America. She's rightly remembered fondly for her work, in particular on women's rights before she even joined the court. But there were a lot of people that were filled with regret after her passing because of the fact that she did not take the opportunity to step down when Barack Obama was president, in particular in 2013 when Democrats also held the Senate. And she was very ill at that time in 2013, and there were very few calls for her to step down, and the ones that were issued were met with rebuke. And we don't want to have that situation reprise itself this time with Justice Breyer, who, as you mentioned, is the court's oldest justice. Conservatives now have a supermajority on the Supreme Court, 6-3 advantage. It's extremely lopsided. That situation threatens to become a worse one if a single illness or death befalls the Senate Democrats. They're just one heartbeat away from losing the majority to Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. And Mitch McConnell has already said that if he becomes Senate Majority Leader again, he very well may block any pick that Joe Biden makes to the Supreme Court next year or any time thereafter. He said that just last week. So the writing is on the wall in terms of the risk that Stephen Breyer is taking if he remains on the court past the end of his term.
But Brian, I guess you have the tricky thing to overcome of the perception of the judge of themselves. In other words, Breyer himself has been adamant that politics plays no role in a judge's work, and he's loyal only to the rule of law, not to an ideology or political party. So is simply asking him to retire enough? How does one actually go about convincing someone with a lifetime appointment that perhaps they are too old for the job?
Well, I think that my voice alone is not going to, certainly not going to convince Justice Breyer to step down. But what we're trying to signal is that there's a broad belief that now is the time for him to take the opportunity to step down. And so you are seeing many more calls than happened in 2013 when the situation was regarded Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Just last week, you had more than a dozen groups sign an open letter urging him to step down. You had almost 20 professors at law schools across the country, some of the top law schools in the country, also signed a separate open letter urging him to step down. There's been op-eds and editorials from newspapers around the country. There's really an echo chamber here that did not exist in 2013. The calls are broad and deep. And we hope that in the aggregate, that adds up and means something to him. But even if it doesn't, I can't get inside Justice Breyer's head and possibly know what might be persuasive to him and what might not be. I think it's important that progressives not respond to this moment passively. I think it was a mistake in 2013 that progressives didn't organize and take further steps to try to have Justice Ginsburg heed the call for her to step down. If you look at how Republicans approach the court, they approach it in a much more aggressive way. In 2018, when Justice Anthony Kennedy stepped down, there were reports of multiple conversations between himself and the Trump White House regarding the circumstances of his retirement. And many people suggested that it was the hints from the Trump White House that they would select a former Kennedy clerk, Brett Kavanaugh, for his seat that finally convinced Justice Kennedy to step down. And just last year, in the final twilight months of President Trump's term, Mitch McConnell was literally calling around to sitting federal judges, urging them to retire so they could confirm their successes before Trump left office. So Democrats have had one hand tied behind their back compared to Republicans when it comes to the courts for too long. So I think it's important as a signal that Democrats are taking the court seriously, that they not respond to this moment passively.
Right. You're sort of getting to the heart of my next question, which is that the justices may see the Supreme Court as an institution, as a nonpartisan entity, but that image is not held by many lawmakers nor Americans as our politics becomes more polarized. So, you're saying that liberals need to take a page out of the playbook of conservatives who've been more focused on the courts for a while. Are you saying that they need to be more active in approaching courts from a partisan lens?
Well, I think that we all wish, in an ideal world, that the courts could exist outside of politics. But the reality is that from the time of the nation's founding, that just hasn't been true. And in particular, in recent years, you see, under the Roberts Court era, you've seen a tilt and a consistency from the Republican-appointed justices on the court in uniting together on cases regarding, in particular, voting rights and the administration of elections. This conservative majority on the Roberts Court issued the Citizens United decision 11 years ago that unleashed dark money into our political system like never before. They've approved voter purging of the voter rolls. They've allowed gerrymandering to continue. They gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013 in the Shelby County case. And so even though there's a lot of observers and Supreme Court watchers that like to take note that sometimes certain cases do produce unexpected alliances among the justices, and there's not always party line breakdowns in terms of some of the outcomes. On a lot of the cases that spill out into matters of politics and how elections are carried out in this country, there's a pretty consistent 5-4 or now 6-3 split on those cases. And so that, to me, just drives home how the Democrats and progressives need to prioritize a strategy for the Supreme Court, because we can pass measures in the Senate that deal with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, for instance. But if the courts remain tilted the way that they are, this court in particular, the Roberts Court, will hollow out that law just like it hollowed out in 2013, the original Voting Rights Act.
Okay, so broadening out the focus then from any one particular judge and looking at some of the reforms to the Supreme Court in general that may be necessary or that may be up for debate. Getting rid of the filibuster could accomplish some of the court reforms that some progressives want. But as we know, that's not something that multiple Democratic senators support. So it's pretty much off the table. Is there any action that President Biden and congressional Democrats can take right now to reshape the courts in a way you believe they should be reshaped that wouldn't involve filibuster reform?
Well, there's a couple ideas that I think should be able to be bipartisan, and we'll see if that's possible. One is a code of ethics for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the only judicial body in the United States of America that does not have a code of ethics to govern the judges or justices' behavior. So there's been lots of questions raised in recent years about trips and speeches and junkets that are sponsored by third-party organizations that these justices go on. A lot of times they're recreational trips. Justice Antonin Scalia died when he was actually on a shooting trip in Texas. And a lot of the circumstances around who pays for these trips and who's sponsoring these appearances, it doesn't have to be disclosed because there's no code of ethics that requires them to do so. Likewise, when justices recuse themselves, they don't have to say why in a case. And so certain conflicts of interest that may be at issue in certain cases don't get disclosed to the public. So a code of ethics is one thing that theoretically Republicans and Democrats should be able to agree to. And then also lower court expansion is an idea that I expect to be addressed in this Congress, and it is one that historically has been bipartisan. We haven't significantly altered the number of district and appellate court judges since 1990, and so we're way overdue by historical standards. In the past, every 20 to 30 years, Congress would add seats at the lower court level in order to keep up with the caseload, and in fact, Chief Justice Roberts himself is practically begging Congress to add at least 80 seats to the lower court. So even if expansion of the Supreme Court remains a polarizing question, theoretically, adding seats at the lower court level could be one that could generate bipartisan support.
Brian Fallon, Executive Director of Demand Justice, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your perspective.
Thank you again for having me.